The archive is open. Come in out of the cold. Your chair is where you left it, the one by the lamp. Tonight's file comes from close to home, the Great Lakes, the cold, quiet, freshwater sea in the middle of a continent, and the ships it decided to keep. You don't need to remember any of this. There's no test at the end. If you drift, I'll keep reading. Let's begin. Most people, when they picture a sea, picture salt. Waves that taste of it, air that carries it for miles inland, a horizon the color of pewter. But there is another kind of sea, and it sits in the middle of a continent, far from any coastline you would find on a map of oceans, holding roughly a fifth of all the fresh water on Earth within 5 connected basins that most of us learned to name as children and then never thought about again. Stand on a beach in Michigan on a still morning, and the far shore is simply gone. Not hidden behind a headland, not tucked around a bend, gone over the curve of the earth, the way an ocean disappears past the edge of what an eye can hold. Gulls work the shallows, the same unhurried way they would along any coast. The water moves in long, patient sets, rising and falling against the sand. There is no salt smell in the air and no tide to speak of. But for a moment, standing there with the wind coming off the water, you could be anywhere with a horizon this wide. But the lakes are not oceans, and that difference is worth holding for a moment, turning it over like a stone in your hand, because it shaped every ship that ever sailed them. Fresh water is less buoyant than salt water. A hull sits a little lower in it, rides a little heavier, a little less forgiving of any extra weight in the hold. And lake storms build their waves differently than ocean storms do, shorter, steeper, and packed closer together than the long, rolling swells of the open sea. A ship caught in an ocean gale can sometimes find a rhythm in it, a breath between one crest and the next. A ship caught in a lake gale often cannot find that breath at all. The waves simply keep coming, one on top of the last, closer together than a sailor's instincts were trained to expect, and there is no rest offered between them, no pause built into the weather. And yet ships came, because the lakes were carrying something no railroad of the time could match, not yet, not at that scale. Iron ore from the northern ranges, mined and loaded and carried south. Grain from the plains, pressed into hulls bound for mills and bakeries far to the east. Lumber cut from forests that seemed at the time endless and floated down to build the houses and sidewalks of cities that were only just learning their own names and their own skylines. This was the freshwater highway, and it built the middle of the continent, port towns growing at the edge of water that could carry a hold full of cargo farther and cheaper than any wagon road ever could. By the later years of the 1800s, these lakes carried some of the busiest shipping traffic anywhere in the world. Smoke from 100 stacks at once, laid flat across the water on a still day. Whistles answering whistles across the fog, one long note calling and another long note answering back. And over the years, this is the plain arithmetic of it. The lakes have taken, by most estimates, something like 6,000 ships. Wooden schooners, iron steamers, barges under tow. Most of them are still down there. Most were never found and never will be, and the water has simply gone on holding them, the way a drawer holds whatever was placed in it and shut. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Stand on a Great Lakes beach today, and you can still watch the big freighters pass boats as long as 3 football fields laid end to end, moving almost silently along the horizon, carrying enough iron ore in a single hold to put the steel into tens of thousands of cars. The highway never closed. It only got quieter. In the ocean, a wooden wreck does not last very long, not in the terms an archive would care about. Salt water is patient but hungry. It gnaws at iron fittings, rusting them thin, and it carries within it a small burrowing creature called a shipworm, which needs salt water to live and which will, given a few decades, turn a solid ship's timber into something closer to honeycomb than wood. Give the ocean a wreck, and the ocean will slowly take it apart, plank by plank, fitting by fitting, until there is little left to find but ballast stones and rumor. A diver visiting most ocean wrecks a century on finds mostly outline, the shape of a hull suggested by scattered iron, and not much else standing. The Great Lakes have neither of those things. The water is fresh, which means no shipworm can survive in it, not one in any of the 5. And at depth, down where the wrecks actually rest, the water stays barely above freezing all year round, in darkness, almost perfectly still, and low in oxygen. Cold slows rust to a crawl, the way it slows almost everything. Stillness means no current to grind a hull against rock, no slow scouring back and forth across the decades. And without oxygen and salt working together, wood simply does not rot the way it does elsewhere, the way we tend to assume all sunken wood eventually must. So a wreck in the Great Lakes does not dissolve. It pauses, and it waits, in its own patient way, for someone with a light to come and find it. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the reason this particular sea has become such a careful keeper of its own history, rather than simply another place where ships happen to sink. Schooners from the age of sail, full-rigged, built entirely of wood, the kind of ship most of us only picture in old paintings, canvas and tar and pine planking, have been found sitting upright on the lake bottom, masts still standing straight up into the dark, name boards still legible along the bow, dishes still resting in their wooden racks in the galley, undisturbed, as if the crew had only just stepped away for a moment and would be right back. Cold storage, century after century, with no bill to pay and no lease to renew. Nothing down there to unmake it. Imagine, if you like, one ship in particular, because there is one that divers speak of with something close to reverence. She was called the Gunalder, a private steam yacht built for a wealthy man, elegant in the way that only money from 100 years ago could afford to be, all polished brass and varnished rail. She went down in Lake Superior, the deepest and coldest of the 5, more than a century back now, and she has rested there, largely undisturbed ever since. Divers who have made the long, careful descent to reach her, and it is a difficult, demanding dive, one not attempted lightly, given the depth and the cold, report that the gold leaf scrollwork decorating her bow is still bright under their lights, catching the beam the way it must have caught sunlight once, on some ordinary afternoon on the water. Not a memory of gold. Gold still, sitting exactly where it was fixed, 100 years and more ago, by someone's careful hands. There is something almost restful in that thought, once you set aside the strangeness of it. The lake did not choose to preserve the Gunalder out of any particular tenderness. It simply happened to be cold enough, dark enough, and still enough that decay had nowhere to take hold. The water kept her the way a good archive keeps anything, not through affection, but through the right conditions, quietly maintained, for a very long time. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. On the deepest, coldest wrecks, divers have found cabins where the paint still holds its color and dishes still sit stacked in their cupboards, 100 years down, and the table is, in a manner of speaking, still set. The Great Lakes are calm for most of the year, patient, workmanlike. the water doing its quiet job of carrying ore and grain from one shore to another, day after unremarkable day. But there is one season when that patience runs out, and sailors have always known which season it is. November is when the lakes show their temper, when the warm air still lingering over the water meets the first hard cold coming down from the north, and the mixture of the two turns violent. Of all the storms that season has produced, one storm in particular is the one the lakes remember by name, the way a person might remember one particular winter out of an entire lifetime of winters. A little over a century ago, in 1913, a storm arrived that sailors afterwards simply called the Great Storm, or sometimes the White Hurricane, because it behaved out on open fresh water, the way a hurricane behaves at sea. For 4 days, hurricane-force winds tore across the open water, and snow fell thick enough to erase the horizon entirely, so that a captain standing on deck might not have been able to see the bow of his own ship, let alone the shore he was trying to reach. 4 days is a long time for any storm to hold its strength over open water without pause or softening. This one did, and the ships caught out on the lakes when it began had no real harbor close enough, in most cases, to reach before it broke over them in full. About a dozen ships were lost across those 4 days. Some simply did not arrive where they were expected and were later found broken on rocks or beaches. Several vanished more completely than that, taking their answers down with them into water that, as we have already learned, does not give things back easily. These were real ships, with real crews aboard, and their loss was a loss to the families and the harbor towns that waited for them. It is right to say that plainly and to let it rest there without dwelling on the manner of it. What followed the storm was not chaos, but something stranger and quieter, a kind of stunned bookkeeping. Harbor by harbor, up and down the shorelines, people simply began counting which boats had come in and which had not, and which were now overdue by hours that were starting to add up to days. Telegraph wires carried short, careful messages between towns that were, in effect, taking attendance for an entire inland sea, one dock at a time, one name checked against a list. And in the middle of that counting, the lakes produced one small, strange puzzle of their own. In the days after the storm, out on Lake Huron, a ship was spotted floating upside down, hull to the sky, keel breaking the surface, entirely unidentifiable from that angle, since a ship's name is painted where you would expect to read a name, not where you would expect to find water. Rescuers and reporters alike could not tell, at a glance, which vessel it was. So the newspapers of the region did something almost tender in its persistence. For nearly a week, they ran the same standing question, printed in capital letters across their front pages: which ship is it? Readers followed the story the way you might follow any mystery with a face you cannot see. The lake, for its part, simply kept floating there, giving nothing away, until a diver finally went down, found the stern, and read the name pressed against the hull, the Charles S. Price. And so the question was answered, quietly, the way most of the lake's questions eventually are, not with a headline, but with a diver's flashlight and a patch of painted wood that had been there the entire time. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. For almost a week, the busiest question on the lakes was printed in newspaper capitals: which ship is it? While the answer floated in plain sight, upside down, keeping its name pressed to the water like a card held face down on a table. Every archive has one drawer that has never been opened. On the Great Lakes, that drawer has a name, and the name is the Griffon, Griffon. Go back about 350 years to 1679. A French explorer named La Salle wanted to trade in furs on the upper lakes, and to do that he needed something the lakes had never seen, a proper sailing ship, built for open water, not a canoe. So his men felled trees and shaped them and raised a hull above a lake that had until then only carried bark and paddles. They carved a winged lion on her bow, the mythical creature that gave her a name, and launched her onto water that had no experience of ships at all. The Griffon sailed west on her maiden voyage. She reached the upper lakes, took on a hold full of furs, and put La Salle ashore to continue his explorations on foot. Then she turned east, toward home, with a small crew aboard to sail her back. And that is the last sentence anyone can write with any confidence. She was never seen again. No wreckage came ashore that could be tied to her with certainty. No message arrived. The lake simply closed over the question, and the question has stayed open for 3.5 centuries. That kind of silence draws searchers the way a locked door draws a curious hand. Over the years, the Griffon has been found more than 20 times, divers, salvagers, amateur historians, each one certain, each one sure that this weathered timber, this scatter of ballast stone was finally her. And more than 20 times, under close examination, the claim has quietly come apart. Wrong century. Wrong construction, wrong lake once or twice. The evidence looks solid in the moment and dissolves the way lake ice dissolves in April present, then simply not. Researchers who study these wrecks for a living call her, half fondly, the holy grail of the Great Lakes. Everyone wants to be the one who finds her. So far, the lake has kept her to itself. There is a story, too, the kind the archive files separately from its facts. Sailors on the upper lakes used to speak, and some still speak, of a ghost ship glimpsed in fog or early mist, sails set, no crew visible, gone again before a second look could confirm anything at all. It is a lovely story. It is not evidence, and it does not pretend to be. The old lake families who tell it usually admit as much themselves, with a small smile, the way you'd tell a story you love without needing anyone to believe it. What makes the Griffon different from every other wreck in this episode is simple arithmetic. She was the first true ship the upper Great Lakes ever carried, and she is the only one this archive still cannot close the file on. Everything that came after her, every schooner, every steamer, every freighter 3 football fields long, sailed on water that had already taken its first ship and kept the secret of where. Imagine, if you like, the search still going on somewhere on the lake tonight, sonar sweeping slowly across a floor of cold silt, patient as the archive itself, no closer to an answer than it was 350 years ago, and no less certain that the answer is down there, waiting its turn to be found honestly, once and for good. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. The Griffon has now been lost for far longer than any nation involved in building her has existed. Searchers have announced her discovery more than 20 times across 3 centuries, and more than 20 times the lake has quietly taken the announcement back. The first secret is still the best kept. Step aboard just for a while. No storm tonight, no trouble, only a working boat crossing a wide lake, somewhere around 100 years ago, on a night so unremarkable that no one aboard her thought to write it down. Up in the wheelhouse, a wheelsman holds his course by compass, one hand light on the wheel, because the shore lights went under the horizon an hour ago, and there is nothing out ahead now but dark water and the faint smudge where the sky starts. He does not need to see land to know where land is. That is the whole of his job tonight, and he does it the way you do the parts of your life you've done 10,000 times, without thinking about the doing. Below him, felt more than heard, the engine keeps its heartbeat through the deck plates, a steady thrum that travels up through boots and floorboards and into the bones of anyone standing still long enough to notice. Coal smoke drifts back from the stack and mixes with the cold night air, a smell that on these lakes has always meant progress, meant a boat under power, meant somebody somewhere feeding a fire so the rest of the crew could sleep. And somebody is. Down in the galley, the cook is awake when almost no one else is, because on the lakes the baking happens at night, so there is bread and pie waiting warm for the morning watch, when they come off their hours half frozen and hungry. Sailors on the Great Lakes have always said that good cooking is how a boat kept her crew, not just fed them, kept them, the way you keep a promise. A galley with a good cook in it was worth more to a crew's morale than almost anything else aboard, and every sailor who ever served a hard season on these waters remembers exactly which boats fed them well. Out on the black water, other boats pass in the dark, far enough off that you'd never see their decks, close enough to trade a light signal, a lamp swung, a lantern answered, brief hellos exchanged between what amount to small moving towns, each one lit from within, each one going somewhere, none of them stopping to talk beyond that one flash of acknowledgement. Then the dark closes back in behind them, and the lake is empty again until the next one comes. Below, in the crew's quarters, the bunks are warm with the day's leftover heat, layered under blankets that smell like coal smoke and lake air, while the deck above stays cold enough to bite. And past all of it, past the smoke, past the rigging, past the tired eyes of the watch, the stars are enormous, the way they only get out over open water, far from any town's glow, close enough to touch and far enough to remind you how small one boat really is against all that sky. And one small thing about the words themselves. On the Great Lakes, size does not matter to the word. A canoe is a boat. A freighter 3 football fields long, carrying enough iron ore to build a city's worth of bridges, is also a boat. Never a ship, not here, not once you've spent any real time on this water. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Lake sailors have always called even the biggest freighters boats, never ships, and they speak of them by name the way you'd speak of a neighbor. On the lakes, the boat you serve on isn't in it. She's a who. Of all the wrecks kept in this archive, this next one is the gentlest, and it might be the one worth remembering longest. Every December in the early 1900s, a schooner called the Rouse Simmons came down Lake Michigan loaded rail to rail with cut Christmas trees, fresh out of the North Woods, bound for the city of Chicago. Her captain was a man named Herman Schuenemann, and to the children of that city, he was not a lake captain at all. He was Captain Santa. Every year he tied one tree to the top of the masthead so people on the dock could spot his boat coming from a long way off, and then he sold the rest right there, off the deck, in the cold. Trees passed hand to hand into a crowd that had been waiting for exactly this boat to arrive. Some families couldn't pay that year, and he gave them a tree anyway. That was simply how it was done. In November of 1912, the Rouse Simmons set out on her usual run, her hold full again with trees for Chicago's Christmas. She sailed into a gale on Lake Michigan, and she was lost, with all hands. That is the whole of it, stated as plainly as it can be stated. A boat and her crew, doing the work they always did not come home that year. Here is the part of the story that the archive keeps closest, because it is the part that matters most. Herman Schooneman's wife and daughters did not let the tradition end with the boat. In the years that followed, they kept selling Christmas trees from a schooner at that same Chicago dock, continuing the run in spirit if not in the same hull, so that the city's children still had their trees, still had their captain's tradition, still had a boat to watch for every December. Grief, in this case, did not close the ledger. It kept the books open and kept them warm. The wreck itself stayed lost for a long while. The lake does keep things, after all. That is most of what this whole archive is about, until a diver finally located her in 1971 off the Wisconsin shore, very close to 60 years after she went down. And what he found in her hold when he reached it is the detail that turns this from simply a loss into something closer to a small miracle of preservation. Fresh water is cold enough and dark enough and still enough at depth that it does not hurry to erase what falls into it. It keeps things instead. It filed this one away exactly as it was. Imagine, if you like, what nearly 60 years underwater usually does to cut greenery, and then imagine that this time it mostly didn't. The trees were still there. Not green any longer. The needles were long gone, lost to time the way needles always are, but the small trunks themselves were still lashed together in their ranks, stacked exactly where the crew had stowed them for delivery, patient in the cold and the dark, as though the only thing still owed was the last mile to the dock. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. When divers finally reached the Rouse Simmons, nearly 60 years down, her hold still held the Christmas trees, needles long gone, but the small trunks still lashed in their ranks, right where the crew had stowed them. A cargo of Christmases, kept cold and dark and whole, still waiting to be delivered. Ask anyone who has spent a working life on the Great Lakes which month troubles them, and you will hear the same answer often enough that it stops sounding like coincidence. November. By late autumn, the lakes themselves are still holding the last of summer's warmth deep down, the way a stone held near a fire keeps its heat long after the fire is out. But the air arriving from the north by then is Arctic air, already carrying winter, already cold enough to mean it. When that cold air crosses that still warm water, the two do not settle into each other quietly. They collide, and the collision breeds storms that can build with very little warning and arrive with very great force. Lake sailors, going back generations, gave that particular fury its own name. They called it the Witch of November. It is worth naming the pattern here rather than any single storm, because the pattern is the older and steadier fact. Every generation of sailors who has worked these waters has had its own November, its own year when the gales came early, or came twice, or came harder than anyone on the docks had been led to expect. The lakes do not reserve this temper for one particular decade. November simply is what it is, year after year, and the boats that go out in it have always known the risk they were carrying alongside the ore and the grain. There is one loss from a recent November that the wider world came to know by name, and it deserves to be told carefully and briefly, and with the plainness such things are owed. For a decade before it happened, the Edmund Fitzgerald was the largest boat on the lakes, a genuine celebrity of a ship, one people drove out to the shoreline just to watch pass, admiring her size and her lines, the way you might admire anything built to be the biggest of its kind. In November of 1975, caught in a gale on Lake Superior, she went down suddenly with all 29 of her crew aboard, and she sent no distress call before she went. Why she sank is still argued about quietly by people who take the question seriously and have spent careers trying to answer it. That is the whole of what this archive will say about the event itself. What the archive keeps more fully is the memory that followed. A ballad written about her carried the Fitzgerald's name around the world in a way no shipping report ever could, and it made her, by a wide margin, the most famous shipwreck of the century, sung in kitchens and cars and rooms that had never given the Great Lakes a single thought before that. And there is the bell. In 1995, at the request of the families who had waited the longest for any kind of resolution, divers made the descent to the wreck and raised the Fitzgerald's bronze bell from where she rested. It sits today in the museum at Whitefish Point on Lake Superior, not far from where she went down, and every November it is rung 29 times, once, unhurried, for each name. In the bell's place on the wreck below, the divers left a replacement, and before they left it there, they had it engraved with all 29 names, so that something with each name on it would remain in both places, on the surface and in the water where she rests. Imagine, if you like, that ringing 29 strokes, evenly spaced, in a quiet room at the edge of the coldest of the 5 lakes, once a year, for as long as anyone keeps the tradition going. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. The Fitzgerald has 2 bells now, one on the surface, rung once for each of the 29 every November, and one below, engraved with their names, keeping the quiet kind of watch, a bell for the living and a bell for the deep. Not every part of this archive lives in the dark. Some of it sits close to the surface, close to shore, close to ordinary daylight, and some of it, happily, sits close to home. In Lake Huron, off Alpena, Michigan, there is a stretch of protected water called Thunder Bay, and it has been set aside as a national marine sanctuary because of what rests beneath it. Dozens of known wrecks lie within its boundaries, and many of them sit in water so clear and so shallow that you do not need to be a diver at all to see them. Glass-bottom boats carry visitors out over the old schooners, so that a family on a summer afternoon can look straight down through the hull of their own boat and watch a 100-year-old deck drift by beneath them, unhurried, the way you'd watch clouds cross a ceiling. Kayakers paddle the same water and look down through 20 feet of lake and read a deck the way you would read a page held under glass. The planking, the hatch covers, the shape of a hull that has not moved in a very long time. No scuba gear required for any of it. Just a boat or a kayak, or simply a willingness to look down instead of out at the horizon for once. Up at Whitefish Point, on Lake Superior, the museum keeps a different kind of collection: the lamps that once lit a pilot house, the painted name boards that once told you which ship you were looking at from 100 yards off, and the Fitzgerald's bell, rung each November for the 29. These are not replicas. They are the actual objects, brought up carefully and kept now in rooms built for exactly that purpose, so that anyone can walk in off a Michigan road and stand close to something that used to sail. And the search has never really stopped. Sonar crews still sweep the deep, dark water where the light never reaches, running their patient lines back and forth across the lake floor the way you might comb a beach you already searched, just in case. And every year or so, it turns something up. Another long-lost boat is found sitting upright in the dark, undisturbed, paint still holding to her name the way it did the day she went down. It happens often enough now that it has become almost a small, expected event on the calendar. A boat, a name, a location, added quietly to the record, and somewhere a research team spends an evening simply pleased, the way you might be pleased to finally place a name to a face you'd been trying to remember for years. Of the roughly 6,000 ships this archive has already mentioned, most are still out there, unfound, simply resting the way they have been resting for however long it has been, in water that keeps its own schedule and answers to no one's curiosity but its own. Sonar will find some more of them in time. Divers will visit some of those. And the great majority will likely stay exactly where they are, filed and unread, for a good while longer yet. It is a strange kind of museum when you think about it slowly enough. The exhibits do not move, are not lit for visitors, are not arranged behind rope lines. They simply wait, in the order the lake put them, and the museum's job is not to display them, but to keep finding the doors that lead back to where they already are, a set of galleries that has been open for well over a century, and is still, a little at a time, being opened further. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. In Thunder Bay, you can drift in a kayak over a 100-year-old schooner and read her deck through the clear water like a page under glass. A museum where the exhibits never moved and the visitors simply learned to float above them. Right now, tonight, while you are lying there with your eyes closed, the lakes are still working. Somewhere out on the dark water, a 1,000-footer is carrying ore from one shore toward another. Somewhere not far off, a second one is carrying grain the opposite way. They pass each other quietly in the night, the way ships on these waters have always passed each other, a brief signal of lights, a small courtesy exchanged and answered, and then each one continues on toward its own harbor. The same freshwater highway, still working tonight, still just as quiet as it has always been. On the beaches, nothing at all has changed. The same cold, clean water meets the same familiar sand, drawing back and returning, patient as breathing, with no particular hurry to be anywhere else this evening. And below, in the dark, the archive holds what it has always held. Schooners sitting upright on the bottom, masts still standing straight up into water that never once asked them to fall. A yacht with gold leaf still bright along her bow, exactly as bright this evening as the day the paint first dried. Small tree trunks, cut and lashed into ranks a century ago, still resting quietly in those same ranks. And a bell engraved with 29 names, keeping its slow watch under Lake Superior, while its twin sits in a lit room at Whitefish Point, waiting for one particular month to come around again. Imagine, if you like, all of it down there right now, this exact night, simply being where it has been for however long it has been, nothing rushing toward it, nothing rushing away. None of it is lost. That word never really fit what these lakes have been doing all along. Kept is closer, filed is closer still. The water never once called any of this lost, only held, the way a drawer holds whatever was placed inside it long ago and has simply not been opened again yet. Most of it remains unfound tonight, and it is in no hurry at all to be found. It will still be there next year and the year after that, whenever the sonar happens to sweep that particular stretch of floor, or whenever, for a while longer, it doesn't. The water isn't going anywhere. Neither is anything it's keeping. Somewhere a museum room at Whitefish Point sits dark and locked for the night, the lamps and the name boards resting quietly on their shelves until morning. Somewhere over in Thunder Bay, the water above 100-year-old schooner lies flat and still under whatever moon is out tonight, with no kayak drifting over it just now, no one looking down at all. That's fine. The deck will still be there to read tomorrow and the day after, whenever someone comes back to look. This is what the lakes have always done, underneath everything else that happens on top of them. Ore boats and grain boats keep their ordinary schedules on the surface, under the same stars, on this ordinary night like every other. And beneath them, patient beyond any single lifetime, the cold and the dark keep doing the only work they have ever had to do, holding everything gently, exactly as it was given to them, for as long as it takes. Sleep now if you're ready. The lakes will keep their own watch tonight, the way they always have, long after you've stopped listening. That's where I'll close the file for tonight. The archive will be here tomorrow. It always is. Sleep well.